The funny thing about people who suddenly become kind is that they usually want something. My husband Charles once told me while we sat on the back terrace watching a summer storm roll across the gardens. I did not fully understand what he meant at the time. I understood it perfectly 2 weeks after Vanessa lost access to $35 million. The morning she arrived at Whitmore Estate, the sky was bright and clear, and the maple trees lining the driveway were beginning to turn shades of gold and red. I was standing in the kitchen arranging fresh flowers when I saw her white luxury SUV slowly make its way toward the house. Through the window, I watched her step out carrying a bakery box in one hand and a bouquet of white peonies in the other. Daniel followed behind her looking nervous. That alone told me something was unusual. Vanessa never carried anything herself unless there was an audience. When the front door opened, she entered with a smile so warm it almost looked convincing. "Mom," she said softly. For a moment, I thought I had misheard her. During the entire time she had been married to my son, she rarely called me Mom. Usually, it was Eleanor. Sometimes Mrs. Whitmore when other people were present. But now it was Mom. She walked forward and handed me the flowers. "I know things have been difficult," she said. "I just wanted to say how sorry I am for everything." Daniel shifted awkwardly beside her. "We both are," he added. I thanked them and invited them inside. Not because I trusted them. Because refusing would teach me nothing. Charles always believed people revealed themselves when you gave them enough room to talk. Vanessa placed the bakery box on the kitchen island. "Apple pie," she said brightly. "I remembered it was your favorite." The truth was it had never been my favorite. It had been Charles's favorite. Vanessa either did not know the difference or did not care. We spent the next hour drinking coffee in the breakfast room overlooking the gardens. Vanessa spoke constantly. She asked about my health, my sleep, my plans for the holidays, and whether I had been feeling lonely. Every question sounded caring. Every question felt rehearsed. Daniel mostly listened. Occasionally, he apologized again for how things had unfolded after the funeral. I noticed Vanessa touching his arm whenever he seemed ready to say something unscripted. By noon they were preparing to leave. Vanessa hugged me before walking toward the door. Another first. "We should do this more often," she said. "Family is important." I smiled politely. "Yes," I said. "It is." After their car disappeared down the driveway, the house became quiet again. I carried the untouched pie into the kitchen and stood looking out at the gardens Charles had planted years earlier. Something about the entire visit felt wrong. Not dramatic. Not obvious. Just wrong. My phone rang less than 10 minutes later. "Martin Keller." I answered immediately. "Martin," I said. "How are you?" There was a pause on the other end before he spoke. "Eleanor, I need to ask you something." His voice sounded unusually serious. "Has anyone new been taking an interest in your finances recently?" I looked toward the driveway where Vanessa's SUV had disappeared. "Why?" Another pause. Then Martin said quietly, "Because someone attempted to access confidential trust records this morning." Martin rarely sounded alarmed. That was one of the reasons Charles trusted him for more than 30 years. He was the kind of attorney who remained calm when everyone else was panicking. Hearing concern in his voice was enough to make me take the situation seriously. I carried my coffee into Charles's study and closed the door behind me before continuing the conversation. "What exactly happened?" I asked. Paper shifted softly on Martin's end of the line. Someone submitted an inquiry through a private financial service requesting information connected to the Whitmore family trust. I sat down behind Charles's old mahogany desk. "Can they access anything?" "No," Martin replied. "The protections Charles put in place are extremely strong. But someone is clearly testing the boundaries." Through the window, I watched a gardener trimming hedges near the east lawn. The estate looked peaceful. Beautiful. It was strange how much deception could exist beneath calm surfaces. "Do you know who?" Made the request? I asked. Not yet, Martin said. But I intend to find out. After we ended the call, I remained in the study for several minutes thinking about Vanessa's visit. Her sudden warmth. Her carefully timed apologies. The way she kept steering every conversation toward my future. None of it felt accidental anymore. 3 days later, she called again. Mom, we were wondering if you would join us for dinner on Saturday, she said cheerfully. Just family. Nothing formal. Family. The word sounded different now. Before Charles died, family meant holidays, birthdays, and traditions. Recently it seemed to mean strategy. Still, I accepted. Sometimes the fastest way to learn someone's intentions is to let them believe you trust them. Saturday evening arrived cool and clear. Daniel and Vanessa's home sat on a quiet street lined with mature oak trees and perfectly maintained lawns. When I walked through the front door, I immediately noticed the effort Vanessa had invested. Candles flickered softly throughout the dining room. Old family photographs had been arranged across a side table. Frank Sinatra played quietly through hidden speakers. Even the menu appeared designed around memories. Roast chicken. Creamed spinach. Fresh rolls. Nearly every dish had once been one of Charles's favorites. I wanted tonight to feel special, Vanessa explained with a warm smile. We have all been through so much. Throughout dinner, she played the role perfectly. She laughed at old stories. Asked thoughtful questions. Complimented my gardening. Repeatedly mentioned how important family was during difficult times. Daniel seemed relieved by the atmosphere. For the first time since the funeral, he looked genuinely relaxed. Yet something continued bothering me. Vanessa never stopped observing reactions. Every smile felt measured. Every conversation seemed to circle back toward one topic. The future. Have you thought about traveling? She asked casually while serving dessert. You always wanted to see Italy again. Perhaps someday, I replied. You deserve to enjoy life, she continued. Without all the pressure of managing complicated finances. There it was again. Not direct. Enough to sound suspicious. Not subtle enough to be accidental. Later that evening, while Vanessa was in the kitchen and Daniel stepped outside to answer a call, I wandered into the living room. Family photographs covered the shelves. Some included Charles. Others showed vacations and holidays from years past. As I turned toward the fireplace, something caught my attention. A tiny black object sat partially hidden among decorative books on a side table. At first glance it looked ordinary. Small. Unremarkable. But decades of managing business meetings alongside Charles had taught me to notice details. I walked closer. The object was no larger than a matchbox. A small lens reflected the room's light. My stomach tightened. It was a camera. I said nothing when Vanessa returned. I finished dessert. Thanked them for dinner. Smiled politely and drove home. Nearly an hour later, standing alone inside Whitmore Estate, I kept seeing that tiny lens hidden among the books. Maybe it was security equipment. Maybe it was innocent. But after Martin's warning, coincidence felt increasingly unlikely. The next morning, I called him before breakfast. Martin, I said quietly when he answered. I think someone may be watching more than the trust. Martin arrived at Whitmore Estate before noon the following day. The weather had turned colder overnight, and a steady wind moved through the trees surrounding the property. I met him in Charles's study where sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor and illuminated the rows of leather-bound books lining the walls. After listening carefully to everything I had seen at Daniel and Vanessa's house, he remained silent for several seconds. That alone concerned me. Martin was rarely at a loss for words. What are you thinking? I finally asked. He removed his glasses and folded them carefully. I think Charles was right to worry. Hearing that sent an uncomfortable chill through me. Martin opened a thin folder and placed several documents on the desk. Over the past 2 weeks, someone has attempted to gather information from multiple directions, he explained. Not directly from the trust itself. They know those protections are difficult to penetrate. Instead, they are looking for supporting information. I glanced down at the papers. Several financial institutions appeared on the list. Supporting information? Appointment schedules. Banking relationships. Investment management contacts. Estate administration records. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Someone is mapping the structure. Martin nodded. Exactly. The realization unsettled me more than the original inquiry. This was not curiosity. It was preparation. Outside the window, a groundskeeper drove a small utility vehicle across the east lawn while the fountain near the garden reflected the pale autumn sunlight. Everything looked normal. Yet the more Martin spoke, the more it felt as though invisible conversations were taking place around me. "Can you trace it?" I asked. "Partially." He slid another page across the desk. One of the inquiries originated through a private financial consulting firm. I studied the company name. It meant nothing to me. Who hired them? Martin shook his head. That information is protected. At least for now. The phrase lingered in the room. At least for now. Charles always said money left footprints. The challenge was waiting long enough for someone to step in their own tracks. During the following week, Vanessa's transformation continued. She called almost every day. She invited me to lunch twice. She sent flowers again. One afternoon she even posted a photograph of the two of us from the family dinner. The caption read, "Spending precious time with family. Grateful for every moment." Within hours dozens of comments appeared praising her kindness and devotion. Friends from the country club began mentioning how wonderful Vanessa had been lately. One woman even told me how lucky I was to have such a caring daughter-in-law. I smiled politely and changed the subject. The truth was becoming increasingly difficult to discuss because Vanessa had become so skilled at controlling appearances. A few days later Martin called again. His voice carried a different tone this time. Not concern. Progress. I think we found something. I drove into Manhattan the next morning and met him at his office. He closed the conference room door before speaking. The consulting firm was not only investigating financial records. He opened a file and pointed toward several highlighted entries. They were also monitoring attorney appointments connected to the Whitmore Trust. My stomach tightened. Monitoring. Someone wanted to know when we met. How often? And where? For several seconds neither of us spoke. Suddenly the hidden camera at Daniel's house seemed less innocent than ever. Martin tapped one particular page. There is more. I looked down. The consulting firm's activity had increased dramatically after the inheritance meeting. The timing was impossible to ignore. Do you know who ordered all of this? I asked quietly. Martin folded his hands. Not yet. Then he slid one final document across the table. The client information section had been redacted. Every detail blacked out except one line near the bottom. Payment authorized through a personal account ending in 4407. I stared at the number. It looked familiar. Very familiar. Then I suddenly remembered where I had seen it before. It was the same account Vanessa used to pay for the annual Whitmore Foundation charity auction. The moment I recognized the account number, a strange sense of clarity settled over me. It was not shock. Charles had spent years teaching me that confirmation rarely surprises you when your instincts have already reached the truth. What surprised me was how quickly Vanessa had escalated her efforts. The inheritance meeting had happened only weeks earlier, yet she was already investing time, money, and resources into understanding every possible path leading back to the Whitmore fortune. Martin remained cautious. The account connection is significant, he said. But it is not enough by itself. I agreed. Charles always believed assumptions were dangerous, even when they felt obvious. Evidence mattered. Facts mattered. So instead of confronting anyone, we waited. The following month became one of the strangest periods of my life. Vanessa transformed herself into exactly the person everyone wanted her to be. Every local charity event seemed to include her. Every community fundraiser featured her photograph. Every social gathering included another story about her devotion to family. One Saturday afternoon, I attended a luncheon supporting scholarships for underprivileged students. The event was held inside the ballroom of a historic hotel overlooking the river. As I entered, several guests immediately approached me. "You must be so proud of Vanessa," one woman said warmly. "She has been absolutely wonderful lately." Another guest smiled. "The way she has stepped up for your family is inspiring." I thanked them politely while noticing the large display board near the entrance. Vanessa's photograph occupied the center. She stood beside children from one of the foundation programs, smiling beneath a headline celebrating community leadership. Later that afternoon, I watched her move gracefully through the ballroom greeting donors and board members. She seemed completely at ease. Confident. Admired. If someone had met her for the first time that day, they would have believed she was generosity itself. Yet every time our eyes met across the room, I sensed something different beneath the performance. Calculation. Careful observation. Evaluation. She was always measuring reactions. Always assessing influence. A few days later, another article appeared in a local magazine. The feature praised Vanessa's charitable work and described her as a stabilizing force for the Whitmore family following Charles's passing. Several photographs accompanied the story. In one image, she stood beside me at a fundraising dinner. In another, she was helping organize a community outreach event. The article portrayed her as compassionate, selfless, and deeply devoted to preserving Charles's legacy. Friends began calling to compliment her. Board members spoke highly of her. Even people who barely knew our family suddenly seemed convinced they understood our private lives. Then Martin called. "I need you to attend a meeting tomorrow," he said. The following morning I joined him at the offices of the Whitmore Foundation. Several board members were present. Most greeted me warmly. One or two seemed unusually formal. The meeting proceeded normally until near the end when a senior board member cleared his throat. "There is one additional matter we should discuss." The room grew noticeably quieter. He exchanged a glance with another member before continuing. "Questions have recently been raised regarding long-term leadership continuity." Leadership continuity. Corporate language always arrives dressed more politely than the truth. "What kind of questions?" I asked calmly. The man shifted slightly in his chair. "Concerns about future capacity. Planning. Stability." Martin's expression remained perfectly neutral beside me. Suddenly I understood exactly what was happening. Nobody had directly accused me of anything. Nobody had challenged my authority. Instead, a seed had been planted. Small. Respectable. Dangerous. Someone wanted influential people to quietly wonder whether I remained capable of managing the responsibilities Charles had entrusted to me. As the meeting concluded, Martin and I walked toward the elevator together. Neither of us spoke until the doors closed. Then he looked at me and said quietly, "The reputation campaign has started." Charles used to say that desperation was the one thing wealthy people could never fully hide. They could disguise it with expensive clothes, polished manners, and carefully managed reputations, but eventually it leaked through the cracks. 2 weeks after the foundation meeting, Martin called and asked me to meet him at his office. His tone was calm, but I had known him long enough to recognize when he had found something important. The morning was cold and bright as I drove into Manhattan. Traffic moved steadily beneath clear skies, and the city looked as confident as ever. Inside Martin's conference room, however, the atmosphere felt different. Several folders were already waiting on the polished table when I arrived. Martin closed the door behind me and took his seat. "I think we finally understand why Vanessa is pushing so hard," he said. He opened one of the folders and slid several documents toward me. At first glance they appeared to be ordinary financial records. Then I began reading. Over the next 20 minutes, a picture emerged that was far more revealing than I expected. Vanessa had spent years cultivating the image of success. Charity galas, luxury vacations, designer wardrobes, exclusive memberships. Everything about her public life suggested stability and wealth. The reality was very different. Several private investments had performed poorly. Business ventures she quietly supported had lost substantial money. A real estate project in Florida had generated significant losses. On paper, she still appeared prosperous. Beneath the surface, the structure was beginning to crack. "How serious is it?" I asked. Martin folded his hands. "Serious enough that several obligations are coming due within the next few months." I looked down at the documents again. Numbers rarely tell emotional stories, but these did. Debt balances, refinancing requests, asset transfers, emergency liquidity discussions. Each page revealed another layer of pressure. "Does Daniel know?" I asked. Martin paused. "I believe he knows some of it. I do not think he knows all of it." That answer saddened me more than I expected. Daniel had always preferred avoiding uncomfortable truths. Charles used to call it his greatest weakness. Not dishonesty. Avoidance. The ability to look away from problems until someone else made decisions for him. Suddenly the recent months made far more sense. The apologies. The family dinners. The social media campaign. The sudden concern for my future. None of it had started because Vanessa regretted her behavior. It had started because she was running out of options. "How much pressure is she under?" I asked quietly. Martin opened another file. "Enough that access to the trust would solve almost every problem she currently faces." The room became very still. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected off neighboring buildings. People hurried along sidewalks below, unaware that lives were being quietly rearranged 20 stories above them. I thought back to every conversation Vanessa and I had shared since the inheritance meeting. Every compliment. Every gesture of kindness. Every carefully timed visit. None of it had been random. She had been working toward a goal. The realization should have made me angry. Instead, I felt something closer to disappointment. Later that afternoon, after returning home, I found a message waiting on my phone. It was from Vanessa. She wanted to invite me to another charity event the following weekend. Her message sounded cheerful and affectionate. Reading it now felt different. For the first time, I could see the urgency hiding beneath every polite word. As I stood looking out across the gardens Charles loved so much, my phone rang again. It was Martin. "One more thing," he said. "A very large personal loan connected to Vanessa matures in less than 60 days. I remained silent. Then Martin added the detail that changed everything. If she cannot replace that money, she may lose far more than her reputation. The next phase began so quietly that most people never noticed it happening. That was what made it dangerous. Large lies rarely arrive all at once. They arrive in small pieces, carried by ordinary conversations and repeated often enough to feel true. A week after Martin revealed the extent of Vanessa's financial problems, I attended a luncheon hosted by the board of a local arts foundation. It was the sort of event Charles and I had attended for years. Familiar faces. Familiar conversations. Familiar routines. Yet something felt different almost immediately. Several people greeted me warmly, but there was hesitation beneath their smiles. Questions lingered slightly longer than usual. Concern appeared where confidence once existed. During lunch, a woman I had known for more than 20 years leaned toward me and lowered her voice. "How have you been feeling lately?" she asked. "Quite well," I answered. She smiled politely. "That is wonderful. There have been so many rumors." Rumors? The word immediately caught my attention. What kind of rumors? Her expression shifted uncomfortably. Nothing important, really. Just people talking. Charles always said that people only call something unimportant when they are afraid to repeat it directly. Later that afternoon, another acquaintance asked whether I was still managing the foundation investments personally. 2 days later, someone else casually wondered if I had considered hiring additional advisors to help with decision-making. None of the questions sounded offensive. That was precisely the problem. They had been designed to sound reasonable. By the following week, Martin and I had heard enough to recognize the pattern. Somewhere behind the scenes, a narrative was spreading. Eleanor Whitmore was slowing down. Eleanor Whitmore was becoming forgetful. Eleanor Whitmore might not be fully capable of handling the responsibilities she inherited from Charles. The story never arrived in complete form. It traveled through suggestions, concerns, sympathetic observations. The kind of comments people repeated because they believed they were being helpful. One evening, Daniel called unexpectedly. We spoke for several minutes about ordinary things before he hesitated. "Mom," he said carefully, "have you been feeling stressed lately?" I immediately understood the real question hiding underneath. "Why do you ask?" Silence lingered briefly. "Vanessa mentioned you seemed tired recently." There it was. Not an accusation. Not yet. Just another seed planted quietly in fertile ground. "I am 70 years younger than Martin Keller and still have more energy than he does," I replied dryly. Daniel laughed awkwardly, but I could hear uncertainty behind it. The conversation ended a few minutes later. Afterward, I stood in the library looking out at the dark gardens while remembering something Charles once told me after a particularly difficult board dispute. Reputations are easier to damage than businesses. Businesses have numbers. Reputations depend on belief. The following morning, Martin called. His voice was controlled, but I recognized frustration underneath it. "We have a problem," he said. One of the foundation board members formally raised concerns about long-term leadership capacity. I closed my eyes briefly. The campaign had reached its next stage. "What happens now?" I asked. "Nothing immediate," Martin replied. "But discussions have started." Discussions. Another harmless word carrying dangerous consequences. 3 days later, an official envelope arrived at Whitmore Estate. I carried it into Charles' study before opening it. The letter inside was polite, professional, respectful. It informed me that, due to concerns regarding governance continuity and fiduciary oversight, an independent cognitive evaluation had been recommended to confirm my ongoing capacity to manage certain charitable and financial responsibilities. I read the letter twice before placing it carefully on the desk. Then I looked toward Charles' photograph resting beside the window. For months, Vanessa had been trying to gain access to the money. Now she was attempting something much larger. She was trying to convince the world that I should no longer be trusted to control it. The letter remained on Charles' desk for nearly an hour before I touched it again. Not because I was upset. Because I was thinking. Charles used to tell me that when someone forces a decision too quickly, it usually means they are afraid of what happens if you have time to think. By now the pattern was impossible to ignore. First came the sudden friendship. Then the financial inquiries. Then the surveillance. Then the reputation campaign. Now they wanted official documentation questioning my judgment. Every move followed the same objective. Control. That evening Martin arrived at Whitmore Estate carrying a thick folder beneath his arm. The autumn sky had already darkened, and the library glowed softly from the light of the fireplace. He accepted a cup of coffee, settled into a leather chair, and placed the folder on the table between us. "I think we finally have what we need," he said. His voice was calm, but there was something different underneath it. Confidence. I opened the folder and found transcripts, invoices, communications records, and investigative reports. Martin had spent weeks following every thread connected to the private consulting firm. Most of the information confirmed what we already suspected. Vanessa had been gathering information, monitoring relationships, building influence, quietly preparing a case. Then Martin turned to a section near the back. "This came from one of the investigators," he said. "It arrived yesterday." Inside was a summary of a private conversation recorded during a financial consultation several months earlier. The meeting had involved Vanessa and an advisor connected to one of her debt restructuring efforts. I began reading. Halfway down the page, I stopped. The sentence appeared simple at first glance. Almost ordinary. Yet it changed everything. "I do not need her affection. I only need one signature." For several seconds I stared at the words without speaking. Charles once said that the most revealing moments in life often arrive disguised as ordinary sentences. This was one of them. Not because it proved greed. We already knew that. It proved intent. Every apology. Every invitation. Every family dinner. Every carefully staged photograph. None of it had been reconciliation. It had been strategy. Martin watched my reaction quietly. "The recording itself is secure," he said. "The investigator obtained it legally through documentation connected to the debt negotiations." I looked up slowly. "Daniel has no idea." Martin nodded. "I believe you are correct." The realization brought no satisfaction. Only sadness. Daniel had spent years convincing himself that avoiding conflict was the same thing as preserving peace. Now he was standing directly in the path of consequences he refused to acknowledge. Over the next several days, life continued as though nothing had changed. Vanessa remained active in charity circles. Social events continued. Foundation meetings proceeded normally. Yet beneath the surface, everything felt different. I now knew exactly what she wanted. More importantly, I knew how far she was willing to go to get it. Then another announcement arrived. The annual Whitmore Foundation Gala would take place in less than 3 weeks. For decades it had been the most important charitable event connected to Charles's legacy. Business leaders attended. Foundation donors attended. Community leaders attended. Reporters attended. The entire social network Vanessa had spent years cultivating would be in one room. A few days later she called me personally. "I am so excited for the gala this year," she said warmly. "Charles would be proud of what we are accomplishing." I listened quietly. "I am sure it will be memorable," I replied. There was a brief pause. "You sound different," she said. "Different how?" Another pause. Then she laughed softly. Stronger. After the call ended, I stood alone beside the library window watching leaves drift across the lawn. Somewhere behind me, Charles's photograph rested on the bookshelf exactly where it always had. The gala was approaching. Vanessa believed she was building momentum. The board still had questions about my capacity. The rumors were still spreading. The pressure was still increasing. But for the first time since this began, Martin and I possessed something far more valuable than suspicion. We had proof. And proof has a way of arriving at exactly the right moment. The Whitmore Foundation Gala had always been one of Charles's favorite traditions. He used to say that charity revealed more about a person's character than business ever could because generosity offered fewer places to hide. On the evening of the gala, the ballroom glittered beneath crystal chandeliers while hundreds of guests filled the historic hotel overlooking the Manhattan skyline. Foundation donors, corporate executives, civic leaders, and longtime family friends moved through the room dressed in formal attire, exchanging greetings beneath banners celebrating another year of charitable work. From the moment I arrived, I could feel Vanessa's influence everywhere. Her photograph appeared on promotional displays. Guests stopped her constantly to offer congratulations. Board members praised her recent initiatives. Several local publications had even featured her work in the weeks leading up to the event. She moved confidently through the ballroom, smiling effortlessly, accepting compliments, and projecting the image she had spent months constructing. Daniel remained close beside her, though he looked increasingly exhausted. The pressure of recent months had begun to show. Martin arrived shortly before the formal program began. Unlike most guests, he seemed entirely uninterested in the celebration surrounding him. He greeted me quietly and then disappeared into a private meeting room near the back of the ballroom. I knew exactly what he was preparing. The main presentation began shortly after 8 o'clock. Foundation achievements were highlighted. Scholarships were announced. Community projects were recognized. Applause echoed repeatedly throughout the room. Vanessa sat near the front beside Daniel, smiling proudly as several speakers praised her leadership and dedication. If someone had walked into the ballroom at that moment, they would have assumed she was the evening's unquestioned success story. Then the final portion of the program began. A senior board member stepped to the podium and thanked everyone for supporting Charles' vision over the years. After several remarks, he unexpectedly invited Martin Keller to address the audience regarding the future direction of the foundation. A ripple of curiosity moved through the room. Martin was respected, but he rarely spoke publicly. He approached the podium calmly and adjusted his glasses. The ballroom gradually fell silent. Before discussing the foundation's future, he began, "There are several matters concerning its integrity that must be addressed." Instantly the atmosphere changed. Conversation stopped. Smiles faded. Vanessa's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Martin continued speaking in the same measured tone that had guided Charles' legal affairs for decades. He explained the importance of transparency, accountability, fiduciary responsibility. Then he introduced a series of documented findings collected during the previous several months. Large screens positioned throughout the ballroom illuminated with records, timelines, and investigative summaries. Guests leaned forward in their seats. Board members exchanged uneasy glances. The first evidence revealed unauthorized efforts to gather confidential information connected to trust administration. The second demonstrated attempts to monitor legal appointments and financial relationships. The third outlined a coordinated effort to influence perceptions regarding my ability to manage charitable and financial responsibilities. The room grew noticeably quieter with every new document. Vanessa remained perfectly still. Daniel's confusion gradually transformed into alarm as he followed the presentation. Then Martin reached the final section. "Intent matters," he said calmly. "Because actions rarely make sense without it." The ballroom screens displayed the documented statement obtained during the debt restructuring investigation. "I do not need her affection. I only need one signature." A collective silence swept through the room. No one spoke. No one moved. The sentence seemed to hang in the air long after the screen changed. For the first time all evening, Vanessa looked genuinely unprepared. Her carefully constructed confidence disappeared beneath something far more revealing. Several donors exchanged stunned looks. Foundation members whispered quietly among themselves. Daniel stared toward the screen as though seeing an entirely different person sitting beside him. Martin concluded with the financial findings. The hidden debts. The pending obligations. The mounting pressure that had driven every decision. By the time he stepped away from the podium, the ballroom no longer viewed Vanessa as a devoted daughter-in-law protecting a family legacy. They saw exactly what Charles had predicted years earlier. Someone who had mistaken access for entitlement and strategy for character. Across the room, Daniel slowly rose from his chair. Without saying a word, he turned and walked toward the exit alone. When the ballroom finally began to empty, the silence felt far louder than the applause that had filled it only an hour earlier. Guests departed in small groups, speaking quietly among themselves as they processed everything they had witnessed. Some offered sympathetic nods as they passed me. Others simply looked thoughtful. Reputations built over years can change in a single evening when the truth arrives carrying evidence. I remained near one of the tall windows overlooking the city while the last of the foundation board members concluded their discussions. The lights of Manhattan stretched across the darkness below like a sea of gold. Charles always loved that view. He used to say that cities looked honest at night because all the distractions disappeared and only the structure remained. Martin joined me carrying 2 folders beneath his arm. The board voted unanimously, he said quietly. Vanessa has resigned from all foundation positions effective immediately. I nodded. Once. The news brought no sense of triumph. Only closure. Martin studied me for a moment before offering a faint smile. Charles would have appreciated the irony. Which part? I asked. She spent months trying to control a legacy she never truly understood. Before I could answer, movement near the ballroom entrance caught my attention. Daniel had returned. He looked different somehow. Not because of his suit or appearance. Because for the first time in a very long time, he was no longer standing beside Vanessa. He approached slowly and stopped several feet away. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he looked down briefly before meeting my eyes. I owe you an apology, he said. There was no rehearsed speech. No excuses. No attempt to shift responsibility. Just a simple sentence delivered with visible regret. I should have listened to you. I should have listened to Dad. The honesty in his voice reminded me of the young man he used to be before comfort became easier than courage. Your father spent years hoping you would learn the difference between loyalty and convenience, I said softly. Daniel nodded. I think I finally understand. We stood there quietly for several seconds. Some wounds heal with dramatic conversations. Others begin healing through simple acknowledgement. This felt like the second kind. Across the ballroom, Vanessa exited through a side doorway without speaking to anyone. There were no confrontations. No scenes. No final speeches. The consequences had already arrived. Publicly. Completely. As the weeks passed, additional changes followed. Several of Vanessa's financial obligations forced major lifestyle adjustments. Her social influence faded quickly once people realized how much of it had depended on appearances. Daniel moved into a small apartment near his office and began rebuilding parts of his life that had been neglected for years. The process was not easy. Redemption rarely is. Meanwhile, Whitmore Foundation entered a new chapter. With Martin's help, I redirected a significant portion of the trust resources toward scholarship programs, housing initiatives, and community grants bearing Charles's name. The projects reflected the values he cared about most. Practical help. Quiet generosity. Real impact. 6 months later, I stood outside the newly dedicated Charles Whitmore Community Center while children played on the lawn and local families gathered for the opening celebration. A bronze plaque near the entrance carried a simple inscription. Legacy is not what you leave behind. It is what continues because you lived. I rested my hand against the plaque and smiled. Charles had protected me. But more importantly, he had protected the future from people who viewed inheritance as ownership instead of responsibility. As the afternoon sun settled across the grounds, I realized something unexpected. The story had never truly been about $35 million. It had been about character. Money simply revealed what was already there. And in the end, character was the only inheritance that truly lasted.